All right, so what we're going to be discussing tonight is we are still going through following the idea of the presence of God through Scripture, and we're kind of seeing how it's one of the highlights of all the books of the Bible. Is God with them? Is God against them? And each book, I think, tackles it a little bit differently, tackles the question a little bit differently, and it shows kind of where Israel's at. How God responds is always interesting, because I think one of the things, at least for me in this study, has been curious, or when I study this in general, is how does God treat unfaithfulness? And it's not the same. Meaning, not that it's not consistent, it means that each situation deals with a different type of how God's going to handle that situation. Okay? Because, there are times it's almost like Uzzah touching the ark. To me, that seemed extreme. Felt like Uzzah was trying to do the good thing, the right thing, by making sure the ark didn't, drop. He touches it, zap. And then God allows people like maybe Solomon or other people to go on with constant wickedness and evilness. And it's as if he's letting it happen. And so one of the things we learn as we're going through this is that just because there's the immediacy of a consequence, or that seems as if there's it's not how God accepted this. God's okay with this. There are times where God lets people live because there's something he's still needing to do through them. There's a work that still needs to happen. And there comes that Romans 8, the vessels of honor versus the vessels of wrath. Just because God is allowing someone to live through something and that he's still going to work through them doesn't also make them a good person. Right? God used Pharaoh, God used Nebuchadnezzar, God used all of these people, Balaam, right? He used a donkey. Just because God will put his spirit in somebody and on somebody doesn't make every action they do okay. And a part of what we learn in Scripture is it's why I struggle with character studies, in the sense of I want to be like Abraham. And Abraham's probably the best of the examples. He's one of the top. Like Daniel really has. But when you look into their lives, I don't want to be all like Abraham, right? I don't want to be all like Moses. I don't want to be like Jacob almost at all. And these people, they are theological inconsistencies if we take their example to be, I want to be like this person. Really, what you're really looking at is each of these stories, you're seeing the grace and mercy of God, and you're saying, I want to be on the side of God like Abraham was. I want to be on the side of God like Jacob was, because I know that my life can look like Jacob sometimes. I know that my life can look like the Judges sometimes, right, where you're kind of in this cycle, and I want God to be for me. Right, it's like when we looked at a little bit and we kind of skimmed over it, but one of the neatest little stories is in when Joshua meets the commander of the Lord's army, and they're about to fight Jericho. There we go. Thanks for helping me out. Y'all are very helpful. And he says, "Are you for us or for our enemy?" And he says, "I'm for the Lord." And basically, he's saying that if you are with God, I'm with you. And it just so happens that Rahab is going to be a person who's from the enemy squad, right? The enemy team, who God is also for because of her willingness to submit to the will of God and join the family of Israel. So, we got to remember that. Agents for the Lord. So now we're in Judges. And each of these judges ends up being an agent for God. And I think this is probably the number one way we need to understand how God works in our lives. In Scripture, there is more times where God sends somebody, or to a nation, or to a village, or somewhere, that how God acts is through people. Right? I mean, if you think about your own life, think about how many times God has benefited you, not directly in the way we would think, God appearing in a dream or God coming down in a pillar of fire, right? Any of you had those experiences? If not, keep it to yourself. Right? No, I'm just kidding. But normally it's somebody who's come our way, who's been the person that we needed, that, the shoulder that we needed, the voice that we needed, the person who came and prayed with us. And all of a sudden you realize, yeah, God was with me because he sent me so-and-so. Right? Agents for the Lord. And that's what these judges are called. Are these people perfect? No. A lot of them are far from perfect. We looked at Gideon a little bit, but Gideon has 4 different times where he doesn't challenge God, but he tests the Lord, right? He tests God. And his testing is, hey, God, just prove to me you're with me. I know you just fought a battle for me. I know we just won that battle. I need another sign. And then he needed another sign. And then he needed a 4th sign. God, I want to know you're there. And I don't know if you remember, it was 2 weeks ago, and I asked you guys to think about the question of God, of when they tested God in the wilderness and he punished them for it, versus Gideon's testing of God. Why did God seem to be okay with Gideon's tests, but not okay with the people of Israel challenging God about how much food they were having and water they were having? What's the difference between the 2 tests? One, if you didn't do it, it's okay. I forgot about it until I was just speaking right now anyway. But 2, why does God allow sometimes people to test him and it seemed to be something that he accepts? And other times, he takes it as a challenge to his character and his will, and he gets upset. In 10. Israel, when they come out of the wilderness, what kind of people are they? What are they constantly doing? Complaining, murmuring, complaining. They just witnessed 10 signs from God, big signs. They were saved from slavery, brought out of Egypt. The reason why they tested God was because they were in a state of complaining. They were in a state of, they were dissatisfied with God. They were dissatisfied with what he's doing. They knew he worked, but they didn't like his work. They didn't want to be in the wilderness. What did they want to go back to? Send us back to Egypt. And so their test was not a, God, I want to do what's right. I want to be there for you. I want to go out on a limb here, right? And do your will, but I need something. I need a little, right? Where are you? And now Gideon, on the other hand, seems to be, God, we are in a place of slavery. It doesn't seem like you're with us at all, right? We brought that up last week, or 2 weeks ago. We read that. He says, how do I know you're with me? All the blessings you promised us, they're not ours right now. I need to know this is actually you speaking. Okay? Now, I think 3 or 4 times within a small period of time is probably a lot. But does God work in our weaknesses? Does God work through our weaknesses? Does he understand when we are weak and when we doubt? And I think God allows us to challenge him in our doubts. I think if you go read the book of Psalms and you don't see a book of challenging God, right, you've only read the first 9. Because go read Psalm 10, go read Psalm 11, go read Psalm 33, Psalm 34, Psalm 42. Not 42, 43. I mean, the entire psalm is, God, you've abandoned us. You've absolutely abandoned us, and it's your fault. I don't want to be there. I don't want to be there. But when we are living our lives and when we are looking for the presence of the Lord, a lot of times what we need to be looking for is people. People. God sends people. God sends his church. God sends agents, right? And they don't always know. It's not like they're given a direct communication from God to say, go talk to Jesse, right? Go talk to Nikki. Go talk to Ed. A lot of times it's the conversation you need at the right time, at the right moment, and we don't even know that God worked that out. And so when we're looking for God, we need to look for his people. Now, what happens when we look for help outside of God's people? What happens when you look for help outside of God's people? Can you get good advice sometimes? I'm not saying there's, if they're not a Christian, they don't have any kind of advice whatsoever. But what is their advice lacking sometimes? The grounding, the spiritual aspect of it, right? We're not just talking about mental health, we're talking about spiritual health too, right? I don't want someone just to help me to have a better day. I want someone to get me to heaven, right? Which is a different method, different methodology, right, than just helping me to have a better day tomorrow and to have a good attitude while I'm here on this earth, but what's going to fulfill me spiritually, right? So a lot of these judges that we see, they come in, they not only rescue God's people, but they bring about something in God's people that causes them to repent, causes them to change, causes them to look to God. Because, you can go in and, right, let's say a person came in and saved you from a nation that you were enslaved to, and they said, now go live your life. I saved you to go live your life. No, I saved you so that you can turn back to who? You can turn back to God. And that's what the book of Judges is the cycle. The cycle is God has agents that he sends to help in our time of trouble, to help in our time of need, and it encourages us to go back to the source of our joy, the source of our comfort, the source of our grounding, right? To be grounded in the Lord. But unfortunately, what we're going to read, these people, they're imperfect. I don't know how to spell it. Imperfect. Is that an R? It's close. Okay. Had to back up. They're imperfect. And the question comes in the book of Judges, who saves the judge? Who saves the judge? The Lord. Sometimes, right, the people who are agents for the Lord, the only person they have is the Lord. And unfortunately, like with Gideon, let's go read chapter 8, verse 22 through 28. This is the cycle of the judges. God picks Gideon up. God's there for Gideon. God shows Gideon puts his trust in the Lord. And how does Gideon end his life? Someone read Judges 8, 22 through 28. Who wants to read it? We got mics. Judges 8. All right. Fred, there you go. I'm going to put this one just in this area. Judges 8, 22 through 28.
All right, Judges 8, 22 through 28. Then the men of Israel said unto Gideon, Rule thou over us, both thou and thy son's son also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of the Midian. And Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. And Gideon said unto them, I would desire a request of you, that you would give me every man the earring of his prey. For they had golden earrings, because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, We will willingly give them. And they spread a garment, and did cast therein every man the earrings of his prey. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, beside the ornaments and collars and purple raiment that was on the king of Midian, and beside the chains that were about their camels' necks. And Gideon made an ephod thereof, and put it in his city, even in Ophrah, and all of Israel went thither a-whoring after it, which thing became a snare unto Gideon and to his house. Thus was the Midian subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted up their heads no more, and the country was in quietness for 40 years in the days of Gideon.
Does this sound a whole lot like another story? The people of Israel, one, wanting to have someone rule over them, right? We'll talk about that in a moment. But this gathering of gold, collecting it, creating an object to worship, Sound like another story? The golden calf, doesn't it? Right? These cycles, this is what we're seeing, these cycles of Israel's history repeat themselves. And I ask the question, what is the need to have a physical ruler that we can follow? What is the need? What is the desire? What is the motivation behind Israel constantly looking for a ruler they can see?
I think sometimes it was so they had someone to actually blame.
Okay. So when you have a scapegoat, right? If you have someone because oftentimes, who does God come down on? He doesn't come down on all of Israel. He comes down on the rulers of Israel, because often Israel just follows in the way of those who are leading. Okay? So they need someone to blame. Anyone else?
They're unable to make decisions for themselves, so they need somebody to rule over them to say, do this, do that.
Unable to make decisions for themselves. I think that's a pretty common thing. You know, I think there are people who would do things if they just need to be told what to do, right? And it's not that they don't want to do something. They just really, on their own devices, can't think of what they should do, or how they should do it. And they want direction. Okay? Anyone else think of anything?
They wanted a leader because everybody else had one.
There is also a desire to be like everybody else, isn't there? There's a desire that, when you see the nations around you, and once again, they've been influenced by these nations, because where have they spent the last 20 years? In slavery, under other leadership, and they see how that looks. Now, I ought to be honest with you, I see how that looks, and I don't want anything to do with it. Right? When I see monarchies and those types of things, they can be good if you have a good person in charge. But if you're just the peon, if you're just a regular member of society, I think part of the problem, probably the pull of having a ruler is, well, he protects us. He takes care of all that other stuff, and we can just kind of live our life and not have to worry about all the big things. Right? Don't have to worry about all the big things. Anyone else?
I had a comment for what you said earlier with your people and your imperfect. There's a prevalence in today's society that people get truth from authority instead of authority from truth. And it's backward thinking. Here's an example, which you brought up here with what they do with the 1619 Project in the United States has taught our children that because our forefathers had slaves, they were hypocrites, and you should not look to them as an authority figure. And so they've rewritten our history to teach us that because those men were imperfect and because they were hypocrites and because slavery hadn't been abolished yet, we should throw that system out, their truth. Well, the same thing, that same indictment they're going to use against people of the church. They'll say, well, Abraham lied about his wife being his sister, so he's a liar. Why would you follow Abraham? The same thing, Mary, they say that now Mary had an illegitimate child, and she, and the Son of God is really, and they use the other word.
Yeah.
And so they indict the person and not the message. God has always used the message as being valid, not the message giver. So you can take the message out, and I think that's why I like the parable of the sower so much, is because it's the messenger is not the focus of the thing. It's the message. And the message is what grows, and God makes it grow.
Yeah.
And I think that's a beautiful example. So when we see people, don't look to the people, look at the message. What are they giving? And learn from that, because everybody we get the message from has imperfections. And if you judge the message by the character of the messenger, you've missed the point.
Yeah. And so to that point, I'll kind of transition into kind of what we're pointing towards a little bit, is there's a lot of self-justification then. If you appoint a ruler who's imperfect, and you say, well, he told us to do it. Right? He told us to do it. It kind of goes like the Nuremberg trials, right? Part of the Nuremberg trials were the fact that, no, I don't care if a general told you to murder innocent women and children. You should know, right? There's a higher moral law, and you can't just dump it on the ruler. But on the negative side, right? I'm not going to accept this message because the messenger is imperfect, right? But there's this desire with Israel to have a physical person sitting on a throne. And I think all of what's kind of been said kind of comes together, right? And but Gideon responds with, who's in charge? The Lord is. They already have someone who's guiding them, telling them, giving them a law, giving them precepts. But I think our struggle, and I think that's why Paul brings up in Ephesians chapter 6, we have a hard time believing that there is a spiritual existence. If I can't see God, I doubt he's there. Right? If I can't see the devil, he's not real. If I can't, whatever it may be. And so we struggle with feeling close to God because I can't see God. I can't hug God. And I think that's a part of why God uses agents. Because having somebody who's there does feel good. Having somebody who's actually can respond and talk back, right, to you in the room when you're going through problems is nice. But that person, you need to realize, is just a person. And their advice is only as good as if it comes from whom? If it comes from the Lord. As long as it's healthy. Right? We kind of talked about in the sermon this morning a little bit. As long as it's true. And this gets back. Unfortunately, like I said, I like my reels. And there are people who can be very convincing in the things they say. Because they're good speakers, right? They're eloquent. They can put words together. I call them wordsmiths, right? They know how to string words together and make sentences that can spell imperfect. And it's like, wow. But the moment you just even dig a little bit, you're like, that's total nonsense. But you wouldn't know because of how much confidence they have and how much. And I think all of us are a little, and not all, but there are a majority of people who don't have the confidence to believe that they can make the right choices for themselves. And so what they want is somebody to say, here is how you do everything, right? And I think that's a part of growing and why we struggle sometimes with kids in school, and a kid comes home and says, this happened at school, and how should I have responded, right? And I wish you were there, so you would have told me, you give them the advice, like, wow, that would have been great. I wish I would have had that then. And so we have to teach principles, teach people how to behave in such a way so because they're going to come to situations that I can't give you every scenario. And so that's why the Bible is very principle-based in teaching us to follow God and know him well enough so when you come to these situations, you know, how would God want me to respond? Well, I know because of this situation, this story, this principle, this command, that God, this is probably my best bet. And even with that, sometimes you'll do what? You'll mess up. And so I think there's some security and comfort in having someone who is ruling over, someone who can take charge, someone who can lead, right? There's some security and some comfort. But unfortunately, Gideon does give some good advice, but then what does Gideon do? He says, the Lord is the one who's making all the rules. You should follow him. But since you're asking, why don't we create this ephod that we can worship? And it says it was the downfall of his family to the point where he couldn't even lift up his head for the rest of the days. Though, for the next 40 years, God gave that nation rest. So, in the midst of this person's imperfection, in the midst of their stubbornness, in the midst of them wanting a ruler, God still grants mercy in this story. And I want to look at one more story. Any questions or comments on that? I wanted to kind of finish that up. We didn't do that 2 weeks ago. I want to get into probably one of the ickiest situations that happens in the Bible. And it's with the tribe of Benjamin. It's just not fun. Do you guys know the story of the tribe of Benjamin, Levi, and a concubine? A man's traveling through a city. It's of the tribe of Benjamin, and he's got his concubine with him, and he's sitting in the middle of the street because nobody will accept him into his home. And then finally a man says, hey, you can come into my house. And I'm not going to read all this. I'll give you the synopsis. And then the people of Benjamin come out and say, you give us this man, you give us this concubine, and they want to do bad things to her. And the man eventually says, take my daughter. And they take the concubine as well, does stuff all night, lays the concubine at the floor, right? The people of Israel find out, the other tribes find out. What do they do to the tribe of Benjamin? Wipe them clean, which I don't blame them, right? The man unfortunately takes his concubine, cuts her up into 12 pieces, sends them out, right? Just an icky story. Icky story. And yet, in this story, when we get to Judges chapter 19, this is when this phrase comes over and over and over again toward the end of the book. And this is going to be a theme in this book. And I wanted to jump off this because what is the very first line of Judges 19? In those days there was no king in Israel. Now, there's a double nature to that. There was no physical king, but also they weren't allowing God to be king. Now, does anyone remember the covenant that all of Israel makes when they go and destroy Benjamin? They say they will not do. What do they say? We will not give them wives. We will not supply wives for them. We will not allow any of them to give up our wives. So they made a covenant. Well, when they start wiping out all of the tribe of Benjamin, it gets down to 300 men left. And what do they realize they're about to do? They're about to destroy an entire tribe of the nation of Israel. They can't do that. But now they've made a covenant, and they said, we will not supply wives or give any of our daughters to any of the tribe of Benjamin. So how do you rebuild a tribe when you've killed all the women, you've killed all the children, and there's only 300 men left? They tell Benjamin to set a trap for the people of Jabesh Gilead, which, by the way, is the people that Saul cuts up an animal and sends it out when they're being threatened because they're a part of the tribe of Benjamin now, to lie in trap and to steal 300 virgins from another nation and to rebuild their tribe. Ugh, right? So there's this desire to save Israel, and yet there are false oaths or bad oaths being claimed that doesn't. So my question is, what would have been the best situation to break the oath and to give children, to give daughters, to rebuild Benjamin, or what they did? What situation do you put yourself in when you make an oath like that, a covenant like that? Jephthah, who's one of the judges before, we know the story of Jephthah. What kind of covenant does he make? Does anyone remember the oath he makes? One of the judges? The first thing, he thought it'd be an animal, and it's his daughter. I will kill and offer to the Lord. And there are people who debate all day long whether he did that. The text says he does it. The text says he does it. He kills his daughter. Now, when we were in our study of Leviticus, if you read the ending, the very last chapter is about oaths. God does actually give them a way to get out of oaths. There's a payment, there's a reconciliation, but nobody ever takes it. But this is the thing about when people are trying to serve God, and Israel's trying to serve God, they say things they don't mean. They make rash oaths. What is God going to do with the tribe of Benjamin? Let's read. All right. Let's start in 21. I'm going to read the first verse here. Now when the men of Israel had sworn at Mizpah, no one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin. And the people came to Bethel and sat there till evening before God, and they lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. They said, O Lord, the God of Israel, why has this happened in Israel, that today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel? They realize immediately, we made a false oath before we started this incursion, this invasion, but we also realize we can't kill an entire tribe of Israel. And the people of Israel said, which of the tribes of Israel did not come up in the assembly of the Lord? For they had taken a great oath concerning him who did not come to the Lord to Mizpah, saying, he shall surely be put to death. And the people of Israel had compassion for Benjamin their brother, and said, one tribe is cut off from Israel this day. What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them any of our daughters for wives? And they said, what one is there of the tribes of Israel that did not come up to the Lord at Mizpah? And behold, no one had come up to the camp from Jabesh Gilead to the assembly. For when people were mustered, behold, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. So the congregation sent 12,000 of their bravest men, and commanded them, go strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, also the women and the little ones. This is what you shall do. Every male and every female that has lain with a male, you shall to devote to destruction. So in their attempt, one, this is way back, to not allow Benjamin to rebuild, they go and almost wipe out an entire city. And then it says they have compassion for their brother Benjamin, and they go out and they kill the rest of the men and women of Jabesh Gilead. And then they're about to deceive Benjamin to go and lay trap as they're running and they're encamping. This is their goal. They go and kill them. You kill all the ones who are males and females who have slept with a male or female, so all the married people. And guess who are left? The unmarried virgins. And as they're running, basically, what do they ask Benjamin to do? Go and trap the virgins, take them for wives. We've saved the tribe of Benjamin. Do you remember why they tried to wipe out Benjamin in the first place? Why did they try to wipe out Benjamin in the first place? Because basically raping a woman who is unwilling. And what is their final way that they decide to save the tribe of Benjamin? Go take unwilling wives for yourselves, virgins. Do you see the craziness when there is no king over Israel? So this entire story ends with this. I'll just read verse 20 all the way to 25. They commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, go and lie in ambush in the vineyards and watch. If the daughters of Shiloh come out and dance in dances, then come out of the vineyards and snatch each man his wife from the daughters of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin. And when their fathers or their brothers come to complain to us, we will say to them, grant them graciously to us, because we did not take for each man of them his wife in battle. So they go and fight. Jabesh Gilead, which Shiloh, by the way, is there. They go and fight and kill, and saying, because we did not come in and take your wives, grant graciously to us your unmarried women. Because we did not take each man from his wife in battle, neither did you give them to them, else you would be now guilty. And the people of Benjamin did so, and took their wives according to their number from the dancers whom they carried off. Then they went and returned to the inheritance and rebuilt the towns and lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and every family, and they went out there from every man to his inheritance. Let's not read verse 25. The way this book ends, and everybody lived merrily, happily ever after. I mean, that is when there is no God controlling, when there is no godly attributes, when God is not known, when God is not in control, when God's presence is not with them, Israel every single time, graciously saving their brother Benjamin, their wisdom is ungodly wisdom. God's not here in this book. In the very last verse, every man did what was right in their own eyes, for there was no king in Israel. And that is a phrase you will read over and over and over and again in the book of Judges. And so if you're reading the book of Judges, you're going, why did I read that book? Why did I read a book about a people who constantly fail God, and at the very last final, you would think at the end of the book, right? You read at the end, there's got to be a redeeming part. There's got to be a redemptive act. There isn't. By the fact, the only redemptive act is God has not completely wiped them out. They are a saved people, right? And the very next story in the Jewish Bible, by the way, is not Ruth. Ruth will come later. Okay, but we read Ruth next. The very next story is 1 Samuel, when Hannah is not able to bear a child. And now we're going to get into the story next week of how does God rule with a king. We've sent judges. It just doesn't work. These judges are imperfect, right? They fail. They're not really in charge, right? And when they make decisions, what kind of decisions do they make? Imperfect decisions. Really bad decisions. Sinful, many times, decisions. They know how to fight and kill and redeem, but they don't know how to lead people to God. And so, what I kind of want to take away from tonight is there are people we put in our circles of influence. Okay? Sometimes they're worldly, and they may have good advice in specific situations. But the people that you want in your life, or it will end in disaster eventually. They may be able to get you through this situation. They may help you in a specific, right, for a weekend or for a week or for a month. But if they are not people themselves who are submitting to God and leading you to God, what's eventually going to happen if you allow them to continue to be your influence? There's going to be no king in your house. There's going to be no king in your life. Because the people that we allow us to influence, we give them power. We give them authority, right? Because they were there for us. Just because someone was there for you, just because someone is an agent for the Lord at this moment in your life, doesn't mean they're good for you forever. Okay? And so each of us has to submit to one king. And our king is God. We have elders in this congregation, loved them to death. But I'm going to tell you right now, if the elder said, hey, go do this, and it was an ungodly thing, the elders we cannot put the blame on them if we follow them into that road. If your preacher gets up and tells you, right, to go do something, you can't say, well, the preacher told me to do it. Each of us are going to be responsible for our own salvation, for our own, right, life with God. And ultimately, we need to make sure that God's the one ruling our life. There are agents that God puts in our way. There are people God puts in our life. They're good, but they're not perfect. God needs to be leading us. And what we're going to find out is even when we have someone as king who is a man after God's own heart, you think Uriah really loves the fact that David was king over Israel? You think Uriah's family loved the fact that David was king over Israel? What it's pointing us towards is eventually there is coming a king who is the Lord himself, who God won't just be present through an agent, but he'll be present for real. And in the New Testament, when it talks about how we are a temple of God and the Holy Spirit dwells with us, we need to understand that we don't just have agents for God in our life. We are an agent for God because we have God in our lives and in our temple. Okay? All right, there's the book of Judges. It ends with a bang, right? There's the book of Judges. It's just not good. I mean, it's just not a good story to read every single time you turn. those judges turn away from God. But what is that pointing us towards? It's pointing us towards Jesus. And we'll look more at that with David and Saul as well next week. Thank you.